I won't do the pursuit of truth. Sorry about the bit of a gap. Well, nothing to do with the pursuit of truth, but so I'm going through the whole process of looking for a new job and the walk of shame to the job centre. Yeah, the things you have to do to survive. That's why I don't like this world, because you have to do all sorts of things to survive, to get money, cap in hand, gears a job, and all that. So yes, I've been distracted, but then I always think that, like recently, even though, you know, personally it's been terrible for me and in lots of ways, I think about what I'm going to talk about now is nothing in comparison to what if I was living as someone in Gaza. So, you know, this is continuing on the Gaza mass wars over, I don't know, it might be a week or two's worth, because we're over 2 months now. Just now the UN, after 3 days of putting it off, voted. I thought they voted for a ceasefire, but apparently they didn't even get a ceasefire. They couldn't even vote for that after, I think it's 11 weeks of this, I think they say in the thing, of diplomacy, and it shows why it doesn't work, because apparently with the UN you only need one against for it all to fall down. What happened to democracy and the rule of, you know, the majority? No wonder nothing ever gets done properly. I mean, what a silly system. That silly system is an easy system to be abused, isn't it? And it's not efficient at all. But all they voted for was to send more aid in. And I don't even know, is Israel part of the UN? Do they have to apply? You know, like, even if they did have a resolution where the world leaders all said, yes, you must have a ceasefire, do they have to do it? Probably not. Because I guess it's within every country to, you know, to control their own sovereignty. But yeah, this isn't really to do with tags and people, and I know, you know, like I often say, it's nothing to do with that. This is to do with humans and how humans interact with other humans. And this isn't exclusive to what's happening in Palestine or Israel. This has, you know, happened historically around the world. It happens other places. This is just our intolerance of each other because of the system that we've put ourselves in, where we've segregated each other into different boxes by, you know, country and etc.
The United Nations has piled pressure on Israel to end military action in the Gaza Strip, demanding an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. It comes as US President Joe Biden warned Israel it was losing international support because of what he called indiscriminate bombing. Well, earlier I sat down with the Israeli ambassador to the UK, Tzipi Hotovely, and I began by asking her whether Israel would accept the UN call for a ceasefire.
Ceasefire now just basically means we would like to welcome another attack of October 7th. This is the only thing it means. Hamas welcomed this decision of the UN.
But food, fuel, water are scarce and disease is rampant. That's why they're calling for the humanitarian ceasefire.
Well, obviously there is humanitarian aid that gets into the Gaza Strip, but unfortunately Hamas is taking over this humanitarian aid. So even for the sake of the Palestinians, it's better for Israel to finish the job.
But do you accept that you are losing international support by the day? Not for what you're trying to do, but the way that you're doing it?
Absolutely not. I think, first of all, American support is incredible. You can see just now, I mean, it was American decision to veto a UN resolution for ceasefire, and you can see the UK support. I've been ambassador to the UK. I've never seen more leaders from the UK coming to Israel. I just went with David Cameron to see in Kibbutz Be'eri the leftovers of Hamas massacre. Yeah. So you can see...
But your most powerful ally...
The world is supporting Israel.
Your most powerful ally, the President of the United States, said also a few hours ago, talking about support for Israel, you are starting to lose that support by indiscriminate bombing. He is accusing Israel of indiscriminate bombing.
So Biden supports Israel's aim of this war to bring back the hostages. And I carry this dog tag to remind everyone, we still have 137 innocent people in the Gaza Strip. The United States, including the president, agrees that the Gaza Strip cannot carry on with Hamas control. So there is only one way to achieve that, which is to uproot the terror infrastructure that Hamas builds. Unfortunately, some of it is embedded in population. So Israel is doing everything to prevent casualties among civilians.
American presidents choose their words very carefully on this issue. Indiscriminate means random, without care. He is saying, you are bombing Gaza without care.
Absolutely not. And you know what? Let's just see history. Americans were fighting ISIS in Mosul. You had much more people that got killed in Mosul, proportionally, than the people in Gaza. And another thing, when you're thinking about the amount of efforts Israel is doing, we're talking about designated places to the Palestinians to hide. We're talking about humanitarian aid. Do you remember, by the way, do you remember a case?
Just on this point,
Mark, I'm asking you a question. Do you remember a case that any country in the world created humanitarian corridor to the enemy? I don't remember you helping Nazi Germany during the war, and I don't remember Americans helping Japanese during the Second World War.
The point I'm trying to
put
make,
it in proportion.
Right. The point I'm trying to make is that the impression, even in the United States and in the White House, is that in your pursuit of Hamas, you're hitting targets even though you know civilians will be killed.
Absolutely not.
But that's what indiscriminate means, and that's what Joe
I can tell you what
saying.
we do. I respect Joe Biden, the President of the United States. I respect the American support. But if there is one thing I protect, is IDF actions at the moment. Why are we doing this? We're doing this because of October 7th, Israel was traumatized by the worst massacre Israel experienced since the Holocaust.
Yeah, they get why you're doing it. The questions I'm asking you about how you're doing it. So, but now the Prime Minister, Netanyahu, says the end of Hamas is near. How near?
So I'm not sitting now in the war room, so I cannot tell you how much time we have left to the war. But I know that as long as our hostages are still there, and I know that as long as Hamas is still firing rockets on our cities, and we're talking about over 11,000 rockets on Israeli cities in the last few weeks.
Well, this is the point. This is the point.
We
the truth
have to
is,
stop that.
It's believed that 3 of Hamas's 5 brigades are still intact. The head of Hamas, Yahya Sinwar, is still in Gaza at large. So the destruction of Hamas does seem some way off. How long will it take? Is it going to take weeks? Is it going to take months? How long will it take?
First of all, I really believe this is a matter of more than a few weeks. So we need time for this, and as you said, there is still a lot of work to do.
Here's my point. If it costs 18,000 lives to kill what you say is 7,000 Hamas terrorists so far, how many civilians will have to die to kill all 25 to 30,000 Hamas fighters in Gaza?
I have a good answer. If Hamas wants to surrender now and to bring back our hostages, no civilian in Gaza will get killed.
Right, but if they don't surrender, the reality confronting Israel is that you're going to have to carry on. You're going to have to, as you say, wipe out Hamas. Do you accept that that could mean tens of thousands more civilians dying in the process?
It's not like we want civilians to get killed. We were caught into this war not because Israel woke up in the morning and started to attacking the people of Gaza. Israel woke up into October 7th, and they were brutally murdered by people that worked in their houses. So Israel woke up in the morning, and we realized that on the other side, there are people that want to commit a genocide to the Jewish people. I think the Jewish people have learned something from the Holocaust.
The Americans say there's a gap between what you're promising in protecting civilians and what is happening on the ground. More than twice as many children have died in Gaza since October the 7th than in all the conflicts worldwide last year. How can that be justified?
I cannot justify any death or any loss of life. This is not the idea. The idea is to justify our duty to our children.
Isn't the danger that, as Lloyd Austin, US Defense Secretary, says, you're in danger of turning a tactical victory into a strategic defeat? In other words, so many youths are going to be radicalized that they continue to fight against Israel.
Actually, the opposite, and I'm so pleased that you're asking this, because 2005, was the day that Israel left the Gaza Strip in order to give the Palestinians an opportunity to build a safe haven next to the sea. Gaza could have been a beautiful place, having industrial areas, having hotels and beautiful, beautiful places. What Hamas turned this place in few months was to a place that uses its people as human shields, takes all the money from Iran, Qatar, and the humanitarian aid it receives to build underground terror city that cost them over $300 million, that could have made a great city, but instead of that, he preferred to build a terror city.
So, okay, you eradicate Hamas. There's a question about whether you can do that. Eradicate an ideology.
We have no question, by the way. We know we can do that.
All right. Well, you get rid of Hamas. What happens post-Hamas in Gaza? What happens to 2 million people in Gaza? What do you think should happen?
So I think the Israeli government's vision at the moment is, in order to have a better future both to the Palestinians and to the Israelis, Gaza must be demilitarized and Gaza must be de-radicalized. So this is the two things, the two pillars. I always love to compare it to the Marshall Plan.
But with under Israeli occupation?
Obviously, we're not interested to govern the Palestinians, but we are interested to make sure that Gaza won't become another terror hub.
But
so
how?
We will demilitarize Gaza. Right. We will demilitarize Gaza because no one else volunteers to do that, by the way.
And then who is in Gaza?
And we believe that together with our allies and with the moderate Arab countries, we can build a better future. But let me tell you my own insight. If education won't be addressed in Gaza, we will end up having another terror organization with a different name.
What do you mean, education?
It means when you had a Marshall Plan after the Second World War, there were two countries which were totally radical, the German society after the Nazi regime and Japan during the war. Those two societies turn out to be a good Western countries that everyone loves to
I don't quite know what you mean, education in Gaza. Who are you going to educate?
I think part, at the moment, under the UN name, the UNRWA schools are becoming terror schools.
So you're talking about re-educating the population?
If you have the UN involvement, then forget about refugee camps. Why should they be refugees after 70 years of having independent life? They could have built their own life, but they didn't.
But re-education is the kind of, you think of China, you think of...
Absolutely not. This is what you did.
Camps
this
and
is what you did in Nazi Germany. This is what the
Muslim
British
Uyghurs and so forth.
You're not learning from your own history. In this residence that you came to, there is a Churchill painting. There is one thing we learned from Churchill's experience fighting Chamberlain's policy is the fact he cannot appease pure evil. So he knew you cannot negotiate with Hitler. We know we cannot negotiate with Hamas. It means we need to have a better future for the Palestinians. And in order to achieve that, you need to do what you did.
Is there still a chance for a two-state solution?
I think it's about time for the world to realize the Oslo paradigm failed on the 7th of October, and we need to build a new one. And in order to build a new one...
Does that new one include the Palestinians living in a state of their own? Is that what it includes?
I think the biggest question is what type of Palestinians are on the other side. This is what Israel realized on the 7th of October. The answer is absolutely no, and I'll tell you why.
Well, then
because
how can
at
there
the
be
moment,
peace?
no, our answer to the reason there is no peace
Israel
is because the Palestinians...
How can, without offering a state to Palestine, how can there be peace in Israel?
Israel knows today, and the world should know now, the reason the Oslo Accords failed is because the Palestinians never wanted to have a state next to Israel. They want to have a state from the river to the sea.
So the two-state solution is dead.
Why are you obsessed with a formula that never worked, that created these radical people in the other side? Why are you obsessed with that?
The Israeli ambassador speaking to me a little earlier. You're watching the News Hour. Coming up, Eddie Jones is back.
Wow. I don't know why they cut it off there. But yeah, she wasn't happy about the two-state solution.
Of national mourning. This is a...
Right now. Next.
UK, in which she suggested her government will not accept a two-state solution with the Palestinians. Here's what Sipi Hotovelli told Mark Austin yesterday.
You need to do
what you did.
Is
there still a chance for a two-state solution?
I think it's about time for the world to realize the Oslo paradigm failed on the 7th of October, and we need to build a new one. And in order to build a new one...
Does that new one include the Palestinians living in a state of their own? Is that what it includes?
I think the biggest question is what type of Palestinians are on the other side. This is what Israel realized on the 7th of October. The answer is absolutely no, and I'll tell you why.
Well, then how can there be peace? How can there be peace in
the reason there is no peace
Israel
is because the Palestinians...
without offering a state to Palestine, how can there be peace in Israel?
Israel knows today, and the world should know now, the reason the Oslo Accords failed is because the Palestinians never wanted to have a state next to Israel. They want to have a state from the river to the sea.
So the two-state solution is dead.
Why are you obsessed with a formula that never worked, that created these radical people in the other side? Why are you obsessed with that?
Well, today Mark was joined by the Palestinian ambassador to the UK, Hussam Zomlot. He began by asking him whether he still envisaged an independent state of Palestine alongside the state of Israel.
I don't envision. This is reality. We are a people, and the people live on our land. We have legitimate representation and government. That is the PLO. Our platform is very clear. There is international consensus on the need that Israel ends its occupation that began in '67, and that a state of Palestine is established with Jerusalem as its capital, and a fair and legal resolution to the issue of refugees. Right. That interview with the Israeli ambassador should not have been shocking to you, Mark. I think what she said was not really the shocking part, because she has been saying this for a long time,
right.
and her government was saying this for a long time.
Right.
I'm really shocked that you were shocked, and the rest of the world, the UK government and everybody else was shocked. I mean, this has been happening for decades, Mark, not just by Israeli words,
right.
by Israeli deeds.
Right. Her point is that everything changed on October the 7th, the murderous attack on October the 7th. And she's basically saying, why should we negotiate a two-state solution?
Yeah, because before the October the 7th, the two-state solution was being really implemented by her government. I mean, look at who she is. Just for example, she was the Minister of Settlements before she arrived to the UK as the ambassador. And Israel has increased its settlement building in the occupied West Bank by 500% while we were in the middle of the Oslo peace process to achieve a two-state solution. We signed the Oslo process in 1993. There were less than 120,000 Israeli illegal settlers. Today we're talking about 750,000 illegal settlers. The West Bank is dotted all over the place, and many commentators are saying Israel has succeeded to undermine the possibility of any two-state solution. The question, Mark, the question is, why the world has failed to take any action during all these years? The very people that they are bombarding in Gaza and displacing, you're talking about more than 2/3 of Gaza has been completely displaced, a reliving of the Nakba 75 years ago. And by the way, I am from Gaza. I know my family and my parents and grandparents. This is the first time in history that the same refugees are being made refugees again and again and displaced again and again.
Now,
with
you
mass
from Gaza. I know you're from Gaza. And isn't the problem this, that Hamas won the last election in 2006, I think it was. Hamas is committed to the destruction of Israel. Hamas carried out the attack on October the 7th, and support for them across the West Bank is increasing at the expense of the Palestinian Authority. So isn't that the big problem for you?
No, Hamas is not part of the Palestinian political system now. The Palestinian people have a state in the international system recognized by the majority of the world, and the government. You asked me. Let me answer. And the government.
I just want to say the polls suggest they are gaining support since October the 7th.
Well, I didn't see the polls, but that would make you and us and all of us think why people see no hope in diplomatic engagements and in political conversations and processes. Because the day before October the 7th, for a period of 30 years, Israel used every single opportunity to deprive people of any hope towards a different future, of stealing more land, of displacing more people, of demolishing more houses. You're talking about numbers, Marx, and over a sustained period of time. And all of a sudden, we are surprised that an Israeli ambassador says absolutely not for two states, absolutely not for a Palestinian state. Why, Mark? Why do?
Let me ask. We're going to run out of time soon. But you know, the question is, if there is a new Israeli government that may want to talk about it, where is the legitimacy for your body, the Palestinian Authority? Support is weak. It's considered to be corrupt. No elections. I just want to ask you, where is the legitimacy? Were any talks to even be considered?
You know, this has been I have to say to you, Mark, this has been the Western governments and media approach all along. The problem is the Palestinian leadership. It was Yasser Arafat, remember, they besieged him for years and then killed him, and we have to look at the Palestinian leadership, change it. The Palestinian people have very clear legitimate representation. The PLO is the organization that represents every Palestinian, inside and outside. I sit here as the head of the PLO office to the UK. I was the head of the PLO office in the US. The PLO is the legitimate representation of the Palestinian people.
Right.
We have leadership that are ready. Until this very moment, as I'm speaking to you, the PLO is committed to international resolutions that includes the two-state solution, ending Israel's occupation. Until this moment, we are committed to a negotiated two-state solution. It is Israel that on the other side has the likes of Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, and the Israeli ambassador
Final
here,
question.
who are supremacists. So please don't talk to me about partners. If Israel, and when Israel is ready, the Palestinian people have sufficient institutions to engage.
Right, last question. What happens after this war, do you think? What happens to Gaza? What happens going forward?
The first thing that we need to do is to reach an immediate, comprehensive, permanent ceasefire, because we cannot even engage in the day after without stopping the carnage, this mass murder, mass destruction of everything. You're talking about more than 250,000 houses in Gaza destroyed. It's going to take us generations to rebuild all that. So we need to stop that, first and foremost. And number two, we can never, ever assess the day after unless we go back to the day before October 7th, and make sure we have answers to the illegalities that have lasted for a long time. We stopped the Israeli machine of ethnic cleansing right in front of your cameras in Jerusalem. Remember Sheikh Jarrah, in the West Bank, the settler violence that is wreaking havoc all over our villages, depopulating entire villages in the West Bank. People are talking about Gaza, but it's also happening in the West Bank. Once we decide on the day before and recognize all that has led us to where we are, then we drill backward. And I believe the only solution is one state of Palestine, end of Israel's occupation, the implementation of the international consensus. And I believe
it's hard to think that Israel is going to think about the day before.
Well, they have to, as happened with all other nations, as happened with white South Africans and the apartheid regime, as happened in all other conflicts. You've got to think seriously that your option of military solutions, of oppression and repression did not work for 75 years and will never work. It's only answering people's legitimate rights that will do.
Ambassador, thank you very much for coming on the program. I appreciate it.
Let's go back to our agenda now, and we're going to turn our attention to the conflict in the Middle East as fighting moves further south in Gaza. The humanitarian crisis continues to worsen. Well, UNICEF says almost 1 million children have now been forcibly displaced from their homes. And here with me from UNICEF is James Elder. Thanks very much indeed for coming in and for being here while you're here in London. We appreciate it, and your patience while we dealt with our fire alarm issues there. Give us an update with the situation on the ground in Gaza. I know you've been there in recent weeks, so tell us what's happening.
Somehow, Anna, it gets worse by the day. The bombardments have been no less intense, but now we have an extra 1 million people in the south. That 1 million people, as children, as you say, displaced, is spot on. That's almost every single child. And so being displaced there means that they are no longer in homes. They're not even often in shelters. They're on street corners. They're on dusty patches of land. So now they're in places where they don't have access to water and sanitation. And not a little bit, but none. The rains have come, so we have what we've greatly feared, which is two threats to children. One is the aerial bombardment, which is unrelenting, and now we have this grave threat of disease. And it worsens every day, and it will continue to worsen until we get that ceasefire.
And give us a sense of why the weather changing makes that risk worse.
So, because children don't have access to sanitation, so you've now got on a street corner where I would go and there'd be no one. A day later, there'd be 10,000 people being moved from another area because they were told it wasn't safe. With no sanitation, middle-class people who previously had a home, with 3 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms, there's nowhere to go to the toilet, so they have to find a place. Water then will throw that sewage through. The sewage system is broken down. There is no fuel for those workers. And at the same time, children are down to less than a litre of what would be clean water, safe water. So parents, even those with a medical background, are unable to keep their kids safe. They can't give them safe water. Disease is rushing through with water. Diarrhea rates are off the charts. And they can't go to a hospital because hospitals are treating children with mortars and amputations, so they know that's not a place. As parents said to Nana, we have to do three things for our kids. We have to use what we know as parents when they're sick. We have to rely on nature, and we have to hope for some luck. That's not what you want when your 3-month-old is very sick with gastro.
Indeed, and in the meantime, Israel says that it's trying to avoid civilian casualties wherever possible. They are saying that they are trying to give people notice of when an area is being targeted, to tell them to evacuate and move to safe areas. Is that process working? Are people evacuating, and are there safe places for them to go to?
It's a great question. So they are evacuating. It's very difficult because often people have moved 3 or 4 times, so you're moving both with the knowledge that your mother's been killed and your reserves are way down, and it's the 3rd or 4th time, but you're moving to a place where there's nothing. So Anna, legally and morally, but legally, Israel, when they choose to evacuate, yes, to give warnings, but they must evacuate somewhere where you have life-sustaining essentials, water, sanitation, protection. They're absent, and they don't really even pay lip service to those. It's just a place people move to. So in that sense, that they might be safe from bombardment, they're not safe from disease. So these safe places are safe in name only.
And Israel says that it's invited aid agencies to set up these safe areas. They say in some cases aid agencies are reluctant to be seen to be collaborating somehow with Israel's offensive and its intentions. Is there more, do you think, that aid agencies could be doing?
Yeah, I mean, I would refute that strongly. I was on 2 convoys to the north, not particularly safe. We will do everything, food, water, medicine, is what UNICEF was taking, World Health Organization, UNRWA, consistently putting yourselves on the front lines to do everything possible. But we are being allowed a much smaller amount of aid than we need to get in. Getting to the north is very difficult. And now, as you say, you have 1 million children displaced. So only a ceasefire enables us to get that aid at the scale we need to. It's unrealistic, and I do think the Israeli forces know that. It's unrealistic to think you can have a pause for a week and meet the demands of 2 million people who have lost homes, nutrition, and so forth. So we can get there if there's a ceasefire. What a ceasefire also does, of course, is gives the world a moment to find some sanity and get those children who are hostages. Like, I think we all hope that unthinkable torment that those mums and dads in Israel faced was coming to an end. Ceasefire lets us make places genuinely safe, toilets, water. It also gets these children somewhere who are in tunnels, I imagine, home to families.
Okay, well, James Elder from UNICEF, we appreciate your time and for coming in. Thanks very much indeed.
Thanks.
Well, we're going to take you now to a news conference that's been held by Greater Manchester Police.
Imagine having to go through that.
Things like Bailey.
Next one.
Very good afternoon. An Israeli military official says the 3 hostages mistakenly killed by Israeli forces had been holding a white flag. The victims, all men in their 20s, were killed in Gaza City after being wrongly identified as a threat. The official said that an initial inquiry into the incident has found that the hostages were fired upon against Israel's rules of engagement. Joining me now from Jerusalem is our Middle East correspondent, Alistair Bunkle. Alistair, we're still awaiting the full investigation into what happened, but the drips of information that we're getting, it does sound just like a terrible mistake.
Yeah, it does. The IDF initially, when they announced the death of these 3 men last night, provided very little detail, but now there are reports in Israel that cite the southern command of the Israeli military that have put an awful lot more detail as to what happened. And I'm going to read you some quite large chunks of what has been reported, because it does make for very interesting reading. Apparently, the incident began when one soldier stationed in a building identified 3 suspicious figures exiting a building several dozen meters away. All 3 of them were shirtless, with one of the figures carrying a stick with a makeshift white flag. The soldier believed that the men moving towards him was an attempt by Hamas to lure the IDF into a trap, so he immediately opened fire and shouted terrorists to his other forces nearby. That soldier killed 2 of the men, whilst a third was hit, wounded, and fled back into the building which he had come from. At that stage, the commander of the battalion, who was also in the building where the shots were fired from, went outside and called on his forces to halt their fire. At the same time, there were sounds of someone shouting help in Hebrew that were heard by other troops in the area. And then moments later, the third man came out of the building, the third hostage, and another soldier opened fire, killing him. The battalion commander apparently then realized that the appearance of this third man was unusual, and it was discovered that he was an Israeli hostage. It says the soldier who immediately opened fire upon the identifying the 3 men did so against protocols, as did the second soldier who killed the third man. So an awful lot of detail about what happened. Obviously a very tragic incident. The IDF say in sort of wider context about what was happening on the ground around that time that they hadn't seen any Palestinian civilians in that locality for a number of days, and what they had witnessed was Hamas fighters dressed in civilian clothing, and so that seems to be how the IDF is explaining this misunderstanding, that these 3 hostages were obviously mistaken for being Hamas fighters. Nevertheless, they say what happened was against protocols, and clearly it was a very grave mistake that led to the 3 deaths of Israeli hostages.
And Alice, the public moods seeming to be shifting, protests taking place in Tel Aviv. Meanwhile, a negotiating team, we understand, is on its way back to Qatar to try and work through some agreement on the release of those hostages.
Well, the mood has shifted over recent weeks, particularly amongst families of the people still being held hostage. I wouldn't necessarily say that mood is indicative of the wider Israeli population, but there are a growing number of people who feel either concerned on one level or angry that, in their opinion, the Israeli government and the Israeli military are prioritizing the military operation against Hamas over attempts to try and get more hostages freed. And we saw that last night. Once this news had come out, there was impromptu protests suddenly on the streets of Tel Aviv, and there'll be more of that today. In terms of the negotiations, I mean, they broke down once the ceasefire ended on the 1st of December, and they haven't really got going again. People we've spoken to, senior diplomatic sources in the region, said they've pretty much had to start from scratch. Trust between Israel and Hamas, who didn't speak to each other, but trust was completely lost. Nevertheless, in I think what can only be seen as a positive sign, the head of the Mossad, which is Israel's foreign intelligence agency, is traveling to meet with the Qatari Prime Minister somewhere in Europe, we're told. We don't know which country, but it's on a sort of neutral territory, and that we can only assume is Israel looking to re-engage in the negotiating process. What we don't know is Hamas's mindset on it and what Hamas might be demanding in return. And so
let's get the latest now on the situation in the Middle East. Lord Cameron has backed calls for a sustainable ceasefire in Gaza, warning that too many civilians have lost their lives in the conflict. The Foreign Secretary said the goal should be lasting peace, and while he stopped short of calling for an immediate ceasefire, the comments will add to the growing international pressure on Israel. This report from Sky's Alex Rossi begins with images of bodies being carried in bags, which you may find distressing.
There is a growing sense of urgency that the situation in Gaza cannot continue. The relatives of this family, whose bodies have just been recovered, claim they were sheltering in a school when they were killed.
My sister was at this point and her children were in her arms. They had all been lying here. Shots had been fired at them, and they had Hebrew writing on their foreheads.
According to the health authority in Gaza, the death toll is heading towards 20,000. And aid agencies say the humanitarian situation is worsening by the hour. The US has stated Israel is losing global support for its military operation. And there's also been a change in tone from other key allies. Foreign Secretary David Cameron visited the kibbutzim last month and saw the carnage of October the 7th. But he's now added his voice along with his German counterparts, calling for a sustainable ceasefire. It is becoming clear that the United States is losing patience with Israel because of the rising civilian casualties in Gaza and the vision about what happens when the fighting stops. But in defiance of the Biden administration, Prime Minister Netanyahu says he opposes calls for a revitalized Palestinian Authority to govern the Strip as an interim measure on the way towards a two-state solution. And as the IDF continue pressing further into Gaza, the Israeli leader is also adamant he'll not bow to any international pressure on the timetable for the military operation.
We will achieve all of our goals: elimination of Hamas, the release of all of our hostages, and a promise that Gaza will not once again become a center of terror, incitement against the State of Israel, and attacks against the State of Israel. We will continue to fight until the end, for the sake of the fallen, and for the assurance of our lives here in the land of Israel.
But things are becoming increasingly desperate inside Gaza the longer this conflict goes on. There is a trickle of aid entering the Strip every day. These trucks carrying supplies were mobbed as they entered through the Rafah crossing. But much more is needed, with humanitarian organisations saying the population is now at breaking point. Alex Rossi, Sky News.
And I'm joined now by our Middle East correspondent Alistair Bunkle, who's in Jerusalem for us. Alistair, David Cameron will have chosen his words very carefully. How significant are his comments?
Well, I think they resemble a shift in the British policy towards the Israel-Gaza war. Up until now, the British government has called for humanitarian pauses in the fighting, but they've stayed clear of the word ceasefire. But David Cameron in this article did say that there needs to be a sustainable ceasefire, and so therefore I think in that respect it does show that the British government is starting to put more pressure on the Israelis and is in line with the Americans. What the Foreign Secretary does say, though, very clearly, is that now is not the moment for the ceasefire, because Hamas have not been militarily defeated in Gaza. There is still the ability for Hamas to fire rockets from Gaza into Israel. We see that every single day. And it is the British opinion that until Hamas are properly defeated, you cannot then move to the next stage of trying to work out what happens next. But he does talk about the need to get more humanitarian aid into Gaza. He does talk about a two-state solution, which is something that the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has pretty vehemently come out against in the last few days and weeks. And, you know, they do tend to, in that letter, the German and the British Foreign Minister do not put a timeline on when the intense fighting should stop, but signal that it should happen sooner rather than later. So I think if you look at it in conjunction with what else is happening around the world, it seems as though the dial has been turned up a notch on Israel to start to conclude this very intense period of fighting and move to the next phase, and signal that the the Americans, the British, and the Europeans are now starting to say to the Israelis, you know, you do not have as long as you want. You might have a number of weeks, but you do not have the ability to carry out this fighting for as long as possible. And that's why I think what David Cameron had to say is quite significant.
Okay, Alistair in Jerusalem, thank you.
Well, let's stay with the conflict in the Middle East. And the Israeli Defense Force claims to have struck 230 targets across Gaza in the last day. The Israeli Defense Force said it will begin scaling background operations in the north of Gaza and turn its attention to the south, targeting areas where it believes Hamas militants to be. Well, that is where a Sky News team witnessed and filmed a drone attack in Rafah near the Egyptian border. A Middle East correspondent Alistair Bunkle has this report and a warning viewers may find some of the images distressing.
Our team was filming inside a hospital in Rafah near the Egyptian border when a series of Israeli airstrikes hit nearby. A father puts his arms around his terrified children and huddles for cover behind a car.
ايش اللي صار؟ ايش اللي صار؟
The injured are being carried away as our team rush towards the site of the airstrikes. There are screams of desperation and the sounds of sirens as the Israeli drone circles overhead with the threat of more incoming missiles. This lady says she is searching for her son. There are women underneath here, one man shouts. The body of a dead child is found and taken away on a stretcher. Another body lay in front of a mangled car, his face covered with a sweatshirt. We don't know why the Israeli military hit this target, but people in Gaza had been told that Rafah was safe. The wounded man is told to stay calm. His eyes wince in pain as he clings to a rock for a pillow. He cannot move his legs. Later too, he is carried away above the heads of the crowd. They keep digging frantically in the earth to find anyone they can, dead or alive. There is little by way of official help here anymore. They're alone. This is Gaza, and this is happening every single day.
Well, let's talk to Alistair Bunkle, who joins us from the Middle East now. Alistair, as you say, this is daily life for many people in Gaza now. Israel has announced that they're now going to focus their attention on the south, which is, of course, where this was filmed, and where they have told residents to flee to.
So the Israeli military feel that they have made enough progress in the north of Gaza to start winding down ground operations there. Now, that does not mean that the fighting will have stopped in northern Gaza. There will remain pockets of Hamas fighters there that I'm sure the Israeli military will be targeting in the coming days and weeks, and they will still be doing more work in terms of clearing operations. But they do have unfinished business in the south, particularly in Khan Yunis and Rafah. where that report was filmed. They believe that there is an extensive tunnel network in both of those locations. They believe that Hamas senior leadership are hiding underground in those locations, and they believe the hostages that remain in Gaza could be being held there. And so I think we could expect to see, going forward, much more attention from the Israeli military focused on places like Rafah. The problem is that they have already squeezed over 1 million people into the south of Gaza, and one of the places they told them to go was Rafah. And now if they're going to conduct those military operations at the same tempo as they've been doing in the north, they have got to push those people somewhere else, and those are being pushed into ever increasingly small pockets of land.
Well, diplomatically, the UN Security Council is trying to reach a resolution. It's been delayed over and over again because of the wording. What hope is there that that will perhaps spur some hope of a ceasefire?
Well, there's a lot of diplomatic talk going on behind the scenes to see whether or not this UN Security Council resolution vote can take place today after 3 days of delay. It is about the wording. It is about what sort of ceasefire is called for. Now, if it is a sustainable ceasefire, then that means a ceasefire that could last for a long time. And the Americans, the British, and others don't believe that the situation is there yet, because as long as Hamas remain in Gaza in some sort of form, both militarily and politically, then if you would have a ceasefire immediately, there is a very high risk that fighting would break out again within weeks, months, or whenever. And so the US is trying to negotiate a form of words in New York so that they can vote in favour of a resolution. The same goes for Britain as well. The reason the UK have abstained or vetoed it in the past is because they feel that the wording has not contained sufficient criticism of Hamas. So we'll see where they get. But the desire, from what I understand, both from the Americans and the British, is to vote in favour of the resolution. If that happens, it will be a big moment. It'll be the first time that the US has voted in favour of a resolution during this war, and the United States, of course, is Israel's closest ally. But it won't mean that a ceasefire comes into play immediately. It might not mean the ceasefire comes into play for quite some time, but it will put more international pressure on Israel to start changing the nature of its fighting.
Okay, Alistair, thanks very much.
Let's see what that was. Nothing to do with ceasefire.
White dressing here.
Right.
Here from the white soy. So this is the...
Evening all. We begin in New York, where after long days and nights of negotiations to avoid a US veto, the UN Security Council has now voted in favour of a new resolution to increase aid into Gaza. But the resolution does not call for a ceasefire. Instead, the language has been watered down and calls instead to create conditions for a sustainable cessation of hostilities. Their words. It also requests the UN Secretary General to appoint a humanitarian coordinator to oversee and speed up the delivery of aid into the territory. Sky's Nicole Johnston has much more.
Jabalia refugee camp in North Gaza, where the war never seems to end. Israel has been dropping bombs here for weeks. This woman keeps saying, "They bombed us, they bombed us." Look, this is my Uncle Salem. Record this. Let people see. There's no dignity in a death like this. These men say more bodies are buried under the rubble. The UN says nowhere is safe. And across Gaza, desperate demand for food, water and medicine. It's hard to find and costs a fortune.
I go to the market looking for canned food, but where do I get the money to buy it? The Israelis forced us from one place to another, and now I can't survive. I can't get food for my children.
But on the edge of Gaza, a small sign of hope. Israel's Kerem Shalom border crossing. Aid trucks are now entering from here, dozens a day. But Hamas says this week Israeli forces killed the head of the crossing on the Gaza side. in an airstrike.
The IDF attacked Hamas militants that came with weapons to our border. The IDF does everything in our power, from one hand, to reach our objective of demolishing the terror regime of Hamas, while operating this large-scale humanitarian operation.
But to Gazans, this isn't enough. They want Kerem Shalom crossing fully opened.
It is the main commercial crossing into Gaza. It's the only one that can take hundreds and thousands of trucks into Gaza to try and help the situation there.
Help must come fast. But diplomats have dithered. After a week of debate, the UN Security Council has finally passed a resolution to increase aid to Gaza, but not to end the war.
Today, this council called for urgent steps to immediately allow safe, unhindered, and expanded humanitarian access, and to create the conditions for a sustainable cessation of hostilities.
It's not far enough for the UN Secretary General.
A humanitarian ceasefire is the only way to begin to meet the desperate needs of people in Gaza and end their ongoing nightmare.
Back in Gaza, people wait for food. They wait for the war to end. And the longer it drags on, the more they lose hope. Nicole Johnston, Sky News, Jerusalem.
Now let's bring in our US correspondent Mark Stone in Washington, who's been monitoring that Security Council meeting today. And Mark, of course, at the Security Council, we had a very explicit warning of the conditions that there are in Gaza right now. Warning of a famine, of all things.
Yeah, it was a very stark moment in the chamber when the ambassador to the United Arab Emirates, who tabled this resolution, which has finally passed, said, "Let's be clear, unless we take drastic action, there will be famine in Gaza." Already half the population there is said to be starving, and now this word famine is being used by aid agencies who are there in small numbers. Look, Neil, I think there are two ways of looking at what has happened today in New York. It is positive, there's no question about that it is positive. While it doesn't call for a ceasefire, the diplomats knew that if the language in that resolution had included the word ceasefire, it wouldn't pass at all, because America would veto it, because America believes that a ceasefire would benefit Hamas and would not allow Israel, or would not give the Israelis the ability to protect themselves. So whether you agree with that or not, it is a fact that had they included that word in the resolution, it wouldn't have passed, and so the whole thing would be a waste of time. And so in their words, they didn't let the perfect get in the way of the good, and so they tried something else, and they tried a resolution which has now passed, which allows for aid to get in much greater, in larger quantities, which is absolutely key given what is happening in there, given the humanitarian situation in there. The other way of looking at this is just how damning an assessment it is of global diplomacy at the moment, that it has taken, 11 weeks to come up with a form of words which does what? All it does is allow aid to get into people who desperately need it. I mean, 11 weeks to come up with that. That's not great. So those are the two ways of looking at it. But pragmatically, the diplomats knew they needed to get something done. They wouldn't be able to get a ceasefire across the line. And so they have gone for this. And the aid is desperately needed. And as long as all this can be implemented, the aid will come now.
So there you go. There are the clips from the last few weeks. Nothing changes. Like I say, it's not about tags, it's not about Israel or whoever. It's about humans that have put these tags on themselves, and how humans interact with each other. That's why the title is there. What was it going to be called? I've forgotten the title now. It was something scandal. Human, not prevention. Human. Oh, it doesn't matter. You'll see what the title is. My brain's all over the place these days, but there you can see that what it's really about is the system doesn't work. Democracy, bureaucracy, it doesn't work. 11 weeks to just do something that, well, most of us would have thought was already being done, well, was being done, but maybe now to a better scale, but the need to fight each other, that's what the system breeds. We're never going to get out of this, we're never going to find peace, we're never going to find harmony, we're never going to have the existence that we all deserve, the one existence that we're all going to taste of, because the system limits us so that it shackles us as human beings and puts us in these boxes that makes us act out these things and makes us fight each other and makes us have that desire, that need to want to do bad things with each other. And at this holy time, in a holy country, it epitomizes it. That's why it's not about tags, it's just about, look, there's nowhere sacred, there's nowhere safe. Why do human beings do this to each other? Why do we never learn? We say we can't forget, so we learn things, but we don't learn things. But well, we do, but the problem is the system prevents us from acting those out. Because if we'd learned, we should have learned by now, COVID or whatever, or these wars, is not to fight each other, to work together. The benefit of that for each other, for humanity. Getting rid of money, getting rid of the division of humanity by land and by other means. Just, it's so bad, like when you look at the human level, the suffering that's going on, wherever the suffering is around the world. Merry Christmas, and if I don't see you before then, have a Happy New Year. Although, you know, all this is all made up as well. But, well, I mean, like New Year, and just another day, isn't it? It's another day of disaster for humanity, and of not seeing each other as brethren, which we all are, brothers and sisters of each other, one species that has one existence, one chance. Take care, take it easy, God bless, and peace.